The rain came before the carriage reached the crossroads, and Eleanor Hartley pressed her gloved hand against the cold glass, watching the grey English countryside dissolve into streaks of water and shadow. Somewhere ahead, at the end of this endless muddy road, waited the man she was promised to marry. A man she had never seen, a man everyone in 3 counties called cruel, proud, and colder than the marble halls he lived in. She had heard the stories for months. The Duke of Ashbourne did not smile. The Duke of Ashbourne dismissed servants for the smallest offence. The Duke of Ashbourne had buried his heart somewhere in the family crypt alongside his ancestors, and no woman, however beautiful, however clever, had ever managed to dig it out again. And now, because her father owed more money than their small estate could ever repay, Eleanor was to become his wife. She was 22, unremarkable in the eyes of society, though not unkind in her own heart, and she had spent the entire journey rehearsing the same silent prayer. Let him be tolerable. Let him not despise me on sight. Let this not be the end of every small joy I have left. The carriage lurched. Her maid, Bess, gasped as the wheels caught in the mud, and the whole conveyance groaned sideways before shuddering to a halt. Outside, thunder rolled low across the hills, and the coachman's voice rose in frustration against the storm. "We cannot go further tonight, miss," he called through the small window, rain dripping from his hat brim. The axles cracked, and the road ahead is nothing but a river now. Eleanor closed her eyes and allowed herself exactly one breath of despair before straightening her spine. There was no use in tears. Tears never mended an axle, and they certainly never softened a duke's temper. "Is there shelter nearby?" she asked. "An inn, half a mile on. But we'll need help getting the trunks free first." She stepped down into the storm without waiting to be told twice, because waiting had never suited her, and because some part of her, some small, stubborn part that her aunt had spent years trying to correct, still believed that a person ought to act rather than simply endure. The mud swallowed her half-boots instantly. The wind tore at her bonnet, and it was in that moment, soaked to the bone and half-blind with rain, that she saw him. He was crouched near the broken wheel of another carriage entirely, a simple black conveyance stranded not 20 paces from her own. His coat, plain and dark, his hat missing entirely, his dark hair plastered flat against his forehead. He looked, in every visible way, like a man of modest means, caught out in weather no gentleman would have risked. A groom, perhaps, or a travelling clerk, or a coachman separated from his master. He was also, though she did not yet know it, shivering violently, having given his own greatcoat to steady the frightened horse, now stamping beside him. "You'll catch your death," Eleanor said, before she could stop herself, raising her voice over the storm. The stranger looked up. Even through the rain, even in that grey, miserable light, something in his eyes struck her, a sharpness, an attentiveness, as though he were memorizing her rather than merely seeing her. "So will you, madam, if you remain standing in it," he said, and his voice was unexpectedly cultured for a man dressed so plainly, though she did not think much of it at the time. Exhaustion and worry had dulled her instincts. "I have shelter half a mile on," she said. "You do not appear to have a coat at all." A minor oversight. His mouth curved, not quite a smile. The horse required it more than I did. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, rain running down her face, and then, without deciding to, without weighing the wisdom of it, she unwound the thick woolen shawl from her shoulders, the only one she owned that had not already been sold to pay her father's creditors, and held it out to him. "Take it," she said. "You'll do neither the horse nor yourself any good if you collapse in this mud." He stared at the shawl as though she had offered him something far more valuable than wool. "I could not possibly." "You could, and you shall, or I shall stand here arguing with you until we are both carried off by fever, and then where will either of us be?" Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, certainly, but beneath it, something closer to wonder, the particular wonder of a man who has spent a great many years being flattered and almost none being genuinely helped. He took the shawl. His fingers, she noticed, were cold as the rain itself. "You are very generous to a stranger," he said quietly. "I am very cold and very late," Eleanor answered, already turning back toward her own carriage. "And I have neither the time nor the vanity to watch a man freeze on principle. Good evening, sir." She did not look back. If she had, she might have seen him watching her all the way down the muddy road, the shawl clutched in his hand like something he intended to keep long after the rain had stopped. She did not yet know his name. She did not know that he had left his own estate 3 days earlier, under a false name and a borrowed coat, determined to see with his own eyes the woman his solicitors had arranged for him to marry, before he ever let her see the Duke of Ashbourne. She did not know that the stranger to whom she had just given her only shawl was the very man she dreaded meeting at the end of this road. The inn was small, low-beamed, and smelled of wet wool and tallow candles, but it was dry, and after an hour, Eleanor had stopped shivering long enough to accept a cup of weak tea from the innkeeper's wife. Bess sat beside her, wringing out her own soaked bonnet, muttering about ruined trunks and cracked axles, and the general injustice of English weather. "You gave away your shawl," Bess said, not for the first time. "Your last good one." He had none at all. He might have been anybody, a highwayman, a vagrant. He was neither, Eleanor said, though she could not have explained how she knew it. Something in his bearing, perhaps, some quiet authority beneath the plain clothes that she had noticed and then dismissed as imagination. The door opened, and cold air rushed in with it, and there he was again, the stranger from the road, his hair still damp, her grey shawl wrapped now not around his own shoulders, but folded carefully and tucked beneath his arm, as though he could not bear to let it touch the mud of his boots. He crossed the room directly to her table, and Eleanor felt Bess stiffen beside her. "I owe you a debt, madam," he said, "and I find I dislike owing debts I cannot repay." It was only a shawl. It was warmth, freely given to a stranger who had done nothing to earn it. "That is not only anything." He set it gently on the table before her, dry now, someone having hung it near the kitchen fire. "I had it dried. I could not in conscience keep it." Eleanor looked at the shawl, then at him. Up close, in better light, she could see what the rain had hidden, that his coat, however plain, was well made, that his hands, though cold, bore no calluses of labor, that his voice carried the particular, unhurried confidence of a man rarely questioned. A small unease stirred in her, quickly smothered by exhaustion and the day's long list of griefs. "You are very particular for a man who nearly froze an hour ago," she said, not unkindly. "I have been told it is one of my worst qualities." He inclined his head. "Might I know the name of the woman who saved a stranger from his own foolishness?" She hesitated only a moment. There seemed little harm in it. He was, after all, only a traveller she would likely never see again. Eleanor Hartley. Something flickered across his face, gone before she could name it. "Hartley," he repeated, as though testing the shape of it. "And you, sir?" "Julian," he said, after the barest pause. "Julian Renwick." It was not, strictly, a lie. It was simply not the whole of his name, and he told himself, as he said it, that a man was entitled to withhold what was not yet safe to give. "Well, Mr. Renwick," Eleanor said, managing something close to a smile, despite the ache in her bones, "I hope your road tomorrow is drier than mine has been today." "And where does your road lead, Miss Hartley, if I may ask?" She looked down at her tea, and for the first time that evening, weariness gave way to something rawer. "To Ashbourne," she said. "I am promised to marry the Duke there, a man I have never met, and by every account, a man I have little reason to look forward to meeting." She had not meant to say so much. It was the fatigue, she told herself later, the fatigue and the storm, and the strange comfort of speaking honestly to someone who would forget her by morning. But the words were out before she could call them back, and she watched something unreadable pass behind the stranger's eyes. "You speak of him with little affection," he said carefully. "I have no affection to speak of. I have only heard what the whole county has heard, that he is cold. that he humiliated the last young lady his family considered for him, that he keeps his household in fear and his heart in a vault. She laughed, though there was no real humor in it. "Forgive me. You did not ask for the particulars of my misfortune." "On the contrary," he said, and something in his voice had gone very quiet. "I find myself curious. What else have you heard of this Duke?" "That he broke his last engagement so cruelly, the young lady left the country entirely. That his own mother despairs of him. That he chose a bride from a ledger of debts rather than a drawing room of hearts, because it is easier to marry a woman who needs saving than one who might refuse him." She shook her head. "I do not say these things to wound him. I have never met him. I say them because it is easier to walk toward a cage if you have already convinced yourself you deserve nothing better." The man across from her, Julian, as she believed him to be, said nothing for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its earlier warmth, gone careful and measured instead. "Perhaps," he said, "the Duke has reasons for his coldness that the county has not troubled itself to learn. Perhaps. But reasons do not warm a house, Mr. Renwick, nor do they comfort a bride who walks into it as a stranger." He looked at her then with an intensity that made her falter, though she could not have said why. "No," he said quietly, "I suppose they do not." He did not correct her. He did not tell her that the very man she described, cold, cruel, heartless by county gossip, was seated across the table from her in a borrowed coat, having spent 3 days traveling in disguise for the sole purpose of learning whether the bride chosen for him by lawyers and ledgers might in fact possess a heart worth marrying. He told himself the omission was wisdom. He told himself he needed to know her honestly before she knew to guard herself in front of a duke. He did not yet let himself examine why her words about him had struck so deep, or why, for the first time in 3 years, someone's honest opinion of him had actually wounded rather than merely irritated. "You will forgive me," he said instead, rising, "if I retire. The road has been long." "Of course." She managed a small, tired smile. "Thank you again, Mr. Renwick, for the shawl." "Thank you, Miss Hartley," he said, "for the honesty. It is rarer than you know." He did not sleep that night. He lay upon the narrow inn bed listening to the rain soften into drizzle, turning her words over and over until they had worn smooth grooves into his thoughts. He chose a bride from a ledger of debts rather than a drawing room of hearts. It was not entirely untrue. His solicitor had indeed presented him a list: suitable families, manageable debts, daughters of good birth, and diminished fortune who would be grateful rather than grasping. He had chosen the Hartley name because the debt was modest and the family unremarkable enough to attract no scandal. He had told himself it did not matter what she thought of him, so long as she came to Ashbourne, so long as the marriage secured the alliance his late father's debts required. He had told himself feeling was a luxury he had surrendered 3 years ago, when Lady Vivian Carrow had smiled at him across a ballroom for 6 months, accepted his ring, and then vanished to the continent with a wealthier man the moment a better title crossed her path. He had built, since then, a very careful wall. He had let the county call him cold because coldness could not be wounded the way warmth could, and yet a stranger on a muddy road had given him her only shawl, without knowing his name, his title, or his fortune, and had asked nothing in return, not gratitude, not acknowledgement, not even the courtesy of his true identity. She had done it because he was cold, and she had one warm thing to give. It was, he thought, staring at the low ceiling, the first entirely honest kindness anyone had shown him in longer than he cared to count. He resolved, before sleep finally took him, that he would not yet tell her who he was. He would travel with her party the remaining distance to Ashbourne under the name Renwick, and he would learn the whole of her character before he let the title stand between them like a wall she could not see over. It was not, he told himself, deception. It was diligence. A man owed his future duchess the certainty of knowing her, and himself, clearly. He did not consider, that night, how much harder the truth would land the longer he let the lie live. Morning brought a pale, washed-out sun, and the news that the carriage's axle could not be repaired before nightfall. Eleanor took the delay with the same stoic patience she brought to most disappointments in her life, though Bess grumbled enough for both of them. It was Mr. Renwick, still Julian Renwick to her, still a stranger of uncertain occupation and unaccountably fine manners, who arranged, with quiet efficiency, for a second carriage to be hired from a farm 2 miles distant, and who offered, with a courtesy that seemed to cost him some private effort, to escort her party the remaining 2 days to Ashbourne, since his own road, he said, ran in much the same direction. Eleanor should have refused. Propriety demanded she refuse. A young lady travelling with an unmarried stranger, however chaperoned by a maid, invited exactly the kind of gossip that could ruin a reputation before a wedding had even taken place. But something in her, the same stubborn something that had made her step into the storm without waiting to be told, made her accept instead. "You need not trouble yourself, Mr. Renwick," she said, by way of token protest. "It is no trouble," he answered, "and I confess, I find the company preferable to my own thoughts." They travelled together for 2 days through the slow green hills of the countryside, and in that time Eleanor learned things about him that surprised her, that he read poetry though he pretended indifference to it, that he knew the names of birds most gentlemen never troubled to notice, that he asked more questions than he answered, and that his silences, though frequent, were never cold, only thoughtful. She learned, too, that he watched her in a way she could not quite name, not the appraising glance of a man assessing a woman's beauty, though she caught him doing that as well, and pretended not to notice the warmth it stirred in her. It was something deeper, as though he were memorizing her responses to the world, cataloguing her kindness to a lame dog they passed on the road, her patience with Bess's endless complaints, the way she gave half her bread to a beggar child outside a village church without a second thought. "You are generous with people who can offer you nothing in return," he observed on the second afternoon as their carriage rattled along a lane lined with hedgerows. "Is that unusual?" "More than you would think." Something bitter passed briefly across his face. "Most people reserve their generosity for those who might repay it, in coin, or in favor, or in flattery." "Then most people," Eleanor said, "have confused generosity with investment. They are not the same thing at all." He looked at her for a long moment, and she felt, not for the first time, the strange sensation of being truly seen by someone whose name she barely knew. "No," he said quietly, "I don't suppose they are." It was on the second evening, in a village inn smaller and rougher than the first, that the first thread of truth began to unravel, though neither of them recognized it yet for what it was. They had taken a private parlor for supper, a small concession Eleanor's diminishing funds could barely afford, but which Mr. Renwick had quietly arranged and quietly paid for, waving away her thanks with the same careless authority she had noticed before and again failed to properly question. The innkeeper, an older man with sharp eyes, had looked at Renwick rather longer than courtesy required when he came to lay the table, and had bowed rather lower than the plain black coat seemed to warrant. "You have been here before," Eleanor said, once the man had gone. "Once or twice," Julian admitted, which was true, though he did not add that he had visited this particular village in his own name, and his own coach not 18 months past, delivering grain to tenant families during a hard winter, an errand no gossip in the county had thought worth reporting, because dukes were not expected to trouble themselves with such things, and so no one had troubled to notice when he did. He looked at you as though he knew you. "Innkeepers have long memories for men who pay their bills promptly," he said, and she laughed, and the moment passed, though it left behind a small residue of curiosity she could not quite shake. Later, walking the narrow corridor toward her room, Eleanor passed an open door and glimpsed, quite by accident, the signet ring Julian had removed and set upon the washstand while he changed for the evening. It was heavy gold, old by the look of its worn edges, engraved with a crest she did not recognize but which struck her, in the candlelight, as far too fine a thing for a man of modest means to own. She said nothing. She told herself it was none of her business, That gentleman of reduced circumstance sometimes kept a single fine heirloom from better days, that she had no right to question a man who had shown her nothing but courtesy. But the unease did not entirely leave her, and that night she lay awake longer than the day's exhaustion should have allowed, turning the ring over in her memory like a puzzle she could not quite solve. They reached the outskirts of Ashbourne on the third day, and it was there that the careful architecture of Julian's deception began, at last, to crack. The estate rose ahead of them across a wide green valley, a house of pale grey stone, towers older than the county's memory, gardens that spoke of generations of careful cultivation, a house that could only belong to a family of considerable and ancient wealth. Eleanor felt her stomach drop at the sight of it, the vastness of what she was about to marry into, the smallness she felt in comparison. "It is larger than I imagined," she said quietly. "It has a way of making people feel smaller than they are," Julian said, and there was something in his voice, regret perhaps, or guilt, that she did not understand until later. They stopped at a crossroads a mile from the gates, where a groom in Ashbourne livery came riding hard toward them, hat in hand, clearly searching for someone. "Your Grace," the young man called, reining in beside the carriage. "We had feared some accident when you did not arrive with the London party." The words hit the carriage like a thunderclap. Eleanor felt every drop of colour leave her face. Beside her, Bess had gone rigid, and across from her, Julian, no, not Julian, never Julian, had closed his eyes for the briefest moment, as though bracing for a blow he had known was coming, and had failed, despite every careful hour, to prevent. "Your Grace," Eleanor repeated, very quietly, the words tasting like ash. "You are the Duke of Ashbourne." He opened his eyes and looked at her, and there was no more artifice left to hide behind, no more borrowed name, no more plain coat to disguise what the signet ring and the innkeeper's bow and a dozen small unexplained deferences had already half revealed. "Eleanor," he said, "I can explain." "You let me speak of you," she said, her voice shaking now, as though you were a stranger. "You let me call you cruel and cold to your very face, and you said nothing." "I wanted to know you," he said, "before you knew to be careful of me. I did not intend." "You did not intend for me to find out this way," she said, "but you intended to deceive me all the same. There is no kinder word for it, Your Grace, whatever your reasons." The groom, sensing something had gone terribly wrong, had wisely fallen several paces back, out of earshot, leaving the two of them alone in the small enclosed space of the carriage, with the wreckage of the last 2 days spread between them. "I gave you my shawl," she said, and her voice cracked at last, "because I thought you had nothing. I spoke to you as I would never have dared speak to a duke, because I believed you were nobody in particular, only a stranger on a cold road. And every word I said, you kept, and let me go on believing a lie." "Every word you said," Julian answered, low and rough, "was the first honest thing anyone has said to me in 3 years. I did not stop you because I could not bear for it to end." She did not answer him. She could not with her chest so tight and her thoughts in such disarray. And so she turned her face to the window and watched the grey towers of Ashbourne draw closer, and said nothing more for the remainder of the journey. The household received her with a formality that felt, after the honesty of the road, almost unbearably hollow. A housekeeper with kind eyes and a stiff back showed her to rooms grander than any she had occupied in her life. A dowager aunt, Lady Prescott, looked her over with the frank assessment of a woman evaluating livestock, and pronounced her adequate, I suppose, though thin, before withdrawing to inform the Duke that his choice, while unremarkable, was at least not an embarrassment. Eleanor had expected cruelty from the Duke himself. She had not prepared herself for the particular ache of feeling betrayed by a man she had, despite every warning, begun to trust. She did not see him again until supper, a formal affair with a table far too long for 2 people who had, only that morning, shared bread and quiet conversation as equals on a country road. Now he sat at the head of it in a dark blue coat that fit him with the unmistakable precision of a tailor accustomed to dressing dukes, and the transformation struck her almost as a second deception, as though the Julian Renwick she had known for 2 days had been quietly murdered and replaced by this cool, correct stranger. "You are angry," he said, when the servants had withdrawn. "I am humiliated," Eleanor corrected. "There is a difference, Your Grace, though I imagine you have rarely had cause to learn it. I did not disguise myself to humiliate you. No, you disguised yourself to test me, as though I were a horse you meant to purchase and wished to examine before showing your hand at market. You wished to know if I was worth marrying without the burden of my knowing I was being judged." Her hands, folded in her lap, had gone white at the knuckles. "Tell me, Your Grace, did I pass your examination? Eleanor, did I pass it?" she pressed, and her voice did not waver now, though her heart was breaking somewhere beneath it. "Because I gave away my only shawl to a man I believed had nothing, and I spoke to him honestly because I believed he could not use my words against me, and it turns out he has used them for nothing else since." The Duke set down his fork very carefully, as though it required enormous effort not to let his hand shake. "You did not merely pass an examination," he said. "You passed every measure I have used, quietly and bitterly, to judge every person who has entered my life since I was 23 years old, and learned that a woman could smile at me for 6 months and vanish the moment a better title crossed her path. You gave a stranger warmth he had not earned and expected nothing in return, and in 3 years no one, not my aunt, not my tenants, not a single soul in the London season, has done that for me. I did not disguise myself to trap you, Eleanor. I disguised myself because I no longer knew how to trust anyone who knew what I was worth before they knew what I was." Eleanor said nothing for a long moment, the anger in her chest warring with something softer, something that ached to be believed and feared, just as fiercely, being made a fool of twice. "That is a very fine speech," she said at last, quietly, "for a man who let me walk into his own house believing I was still speaking to a stranger." She rose from the table before he could answer, and left him alone with the long silence of his ancestors' portraits watching from the walls, and the terrible, familiar knowledge that he had, once again, protected his heart so carefully that he had wounded the one person who had never asked to see it. The days that followed settled into a strange, careful distance. Eleanor kept to the gardens and the library, avoiding the Duke's company wherever propriety allowed, though the size of Ashbourne made complete avoidance impossible. She caught him, more than once, watching her across some formal gathering with an expression she could not quite name, not quite regret, not quite longing, something suspended between the two, like a man standing at the edge of a bridge he did not know how to cross. Lady Prescott, meanwhile, had opinions, and shared them liberally. "You would do well to forgive him quickly," the older woman said one afternoon, finding Eleanor alone in the orangery among the potted lemon trees. "Julian has not smiled properly in 3 years. I had begun to think the muscles for it had atrophied entirely. He deceived me. He tested you, which is not the same crime, however much it feels like one." Lady Prescott settled herself onto a stone bench with the deliberateness of a woman who intended to stay and finish her point. "You should know, child, that the last woman he trusted took his ring, his affection, and 6 months of his patience, and left him for a Marcus the moment the Marcus's father died, and left him richer. Julian does not tell that story to strangers, but the whole county whispered it for a year, and he has spent every day since building walls thick enough that no one could ever again do to him what she did." Eleanor said nothing, though something in her chest had gone very still. "He did not disguise himself to wound you," the aunt continued. "He disguised himself because he could not bear to be loved for his title one more time, and could not risk finding out that you, too, only wanted a duke's fortune, and not the man beneath it. That is not cruelty, my dear. That is the particular cowardice of a heart that has already been broken once, and does not trust itself to survive a second time. That does not make the deception forgivable." "No," Lady Prescott agreed. "But it might make it understandable, and understanding, in my long experience, is very often the first small bridge across an unforgivable thing. There was, too, the matter of her father's letter, which arrived by messenger only 2 days after her arrival at Ashbourne, and which Eleanor read alone in her rooms with a growing, sinking dread. Her father wrote, as he always wrote, in a hand grown shaky with age and worry, thanking her for her sacrifice, praising the Duke's generosity in settling the family's debts before the wedding had even taken place, and confessing, almost as an afterthought buried in the final lines, that the sum forgiven had been larger than either of them had ever admitted to her, large enough that without it, the family would have lost not merely comfort, but the roof over their heads entirely, and her younger brother's place at school besides. Eleanor set the letter down with trembling hands. She had known, in the vague way one knows an unpleasant truth without examining its edges too closely, that her marriage was meant to solve her family's difficulties. She had not known the difficulties ran so deep, nor that Julian had known the full sum from the beginning and had said nothing of it to her directly, allowing her instead to discover the scale of her own family's desperation second-hand through her father's careless gratitude. It reopened, cruelly, the very wound Cordelia had already been working to widen. If the debt was so large, Eleanor reasoned in her darker hours, then perhaps she had been chosen not for the shawl at all, not for any honest quality the road had revealed in her, but simply because a family so deeply in his debt could never refuse him, could never risk offending a man capable of ruining them with a single stroke of a pen. Perhaps the tenderness on the road had been genuine, and perhaps it had also been entirely irrelevant, a pleasant coincidence layered atop an arrangement that would have proceeded regardless of what kind of woman she turned out to be. She did not raise the matter with Julian directly. Pride and a creeping fresh humiliation kept her silent, and the silence, joining hands with Cordelia's careful poison, deepened the distance between them in the days that followed, until even Lady Prescott began to remark, with uncharacteristic gentleness, that the two young people seemed to be circling each other like wary animals, rather than approaching like a couple soon to be wed. It was Bess, of all people, who finally pressed the question Eleanor had been too proud to ask aloud. "You have not smiled since the letter came, miss," her maid said one evening, brushing out Eleanor's hair before the fire with more force than the task strictly required. "Whatever it said, it has settled on you like a fog." "It said nothing I did not already suspect," Eleanor answered. "Only that the debt was larger than I knew, and that I have perhaps mistaken kindness for calculation this whole while." "Or," Bess said, with the blunt wisdom of a servant who had watched a great many courtships from the edges of drawing-rooms, "you have mistaken a man's silence for his meaning, which is a very different error, and one far easier to mend, if you would only ask him plainly, instead of drowning yourself in guesses." Eleanor said nothing, but the words lodged themselves alongside her father's letter, and it was with both weighing heavily on her that she wandered, sleepless, into the portrait gallery that same evening, seeking nothing more than the quiet company of her own unsettled thoughts. It was that evening, walking alone through the portrait gallery with a single candle for company, that Eleanor found the painting. It hung near the end of the long corridor, half in shadow, a portrait of a young man, perhaps 17 years of age, dark-haired, solemn-eyed, standing beside an older woman whose resemblance to him was unmistakable. A small brass plate beneath the frame read, "Julian, Duke of Ashbourne, and his mother, the late Duchess, 1809. Eleanor stood before it a long while, studying the boy's face for some trace of the cold, guarded man she had come to know, and finding instead only a quiet, watchful sadness that seemed to have been there long before any broken engagement could have caused it. "She died the following winter," said a voice behind her, and Eleanor turned to find the Duke himself standing a few paces away, his own candle throwing long shadows across the gallery floor. "A fever. My father followed 4 years later, though drink did what the fever could not quite manage on its own. I inherited the title at 19, along with debts I did not fully understand, and a household that had already learned to expect very little warmth from the man at its head." "I did not know," Eleanor said quietly. "Few do. It is not the sort of thing one announces at supper. He came to stand beside her, looking up at the painting, rather than at her. I built a great deal of coldness after that, Eleanor, because coldness could not disappoint anyone the way warmth had disappointed me. And then Vivian came, and I thought, foolishly I see now, that perhaps I had been wrong, that perhaps warmth could still be trusted. She proved otherwise rather thoroughly. And so you decided to test me before you would risk being wrong a third time? Yes. He turned to face her fully now, and there was nothing guarded in his expression at all, only a rawness she had not expected from a man the county called heartless. It was cowardice, dressed as caution, and I am not proud of it. But I will tell you this honestly, since honesty is the one debt I still owe you above all others. I have not, in 3 years, wanted anything the way I have wanted, these past 3 days, for you to look at me the way you looked at me on that road, before you knew what I was. Eleanor felt her carefully guarded anger begin, treacherously, to soften. And how did I look at you? As though I were simply a man, Julian said, cold and wet and foolish enough to give my coat to a frightened horse, and worth helping regardless. No one has looked at me that way since I was a boy in that painting, Eleanor. I did not want to lose it the moment you learned my name. She should have forgiven him then. Some part of her wanted to, the same stubborn, generous part that had unwound her shawl in the rain without calculating the cost. But pride, wounded pride, was a slower creature than the heart, and Eleanor found herself stepping back rather than forward. I need time, she said. You have had 3 days to study me, Your Grace. I have had scarcely one to understand you. Take whatever time you require, he said, and though disappointment flickered across his face, he did not press her further, and she found herself, despite everything, grateful for that restraint. It was in that space, that careful, unresolved distance, that Lady Cordelia Ashworth arrived at Ashbourne, uninvited, but not unexpected, for she had long considered herself the more natural choice for the Duke's hand, and she did not intend to surrender the field without a final effort. Cordelia was beautiful in the practiced, deliberate way of women who had been taught from the cradle that beauty was currency, and she wielded it now with the precision of a woman entering a battle she believed she could still win. "Miss Hartley," she said, at their first meeting in the drawing-room, with a smile sharp enough to cut, "how very fortunate you are. I confess, I did not think the Duke would settle for a bride chosen from his solicitor's ledger of debts, but I suppose desperate circumstances make strange bedfellows of us all." "I suppose they do," Eleanor answered evenly, refusing to grant Cordelia the satisfaction of a wounded reply, though the words had landed exactly where they were aimed. "Of course," Cordelia continued, settling herself with practiced grace into the best chair in the room. "Julian and I have known each other since childhood. There is a particular understanding between people who need no ledger to explain their connection." She glanced meaningfully toward the door, where the Duke had just entered, and softened her expression into something warmer, more familiar. "Is that not so, Julian? We are old acquaintances, Cordelia," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "I would not overstate the connection. But the damage, however small, had been planted, and Eleanor felt it take root in the soil of her already uncertain trust. That evening, alone in her room, she found herself wondering whether the Duke's tenderness toward her had been genuine at all, or whether, as Cordelia's pointed comments implied, he moved easily between women, offering warmth as a strategy rather than a truth, testing her as he had perhaps tested others before her. The doubt, once planted, grew quickly in the dark. The following days brought a slow campaign of small cruelties, each too subtle to challenge outright, each calculated to widen the crack Cordelia had found. She arranged, with apparent innocence, to be seated beside the Duke at every meal. She recalled shared memories of hunts and balls, in a voice pitched to carry. She let slip, with practiced carelessness, that she had once believed herself destined to be the next Duchess of Ashbourne, and that only his family's sudden financial troubles had redirected his attentions elsewhere. "It is not his fault, of course," she confided to Eleanor one afternoon in the garden, with the particular gentleness reserved for delivering the worst wounds. "A man in his position must marry sensibly. Feeling is a luxury the aristocracy cannot always afford. I imagine he is quite fond of you, in his way, as fond as a man can be of an arrangement at least." Eleanor said nothing, though the words lodged themselves deep, feeding the small, cold fear she had carried since the road. The fear that she had been chosen not for herself, but for her manageable debts, her unremarkable family, her convenient lack of connections that might have complicated the arrangement. It did not help that Julian himself, wounded by her continued distance, and unsure how to close it without pressing where he was not wanted, had grown quieter, more formal, retreating into exactly the cold correctness the county had always accused him of. Eleanor read this retreat as confirmation of Cordelia's poison rather than what it truly was. A man uncertain how to reach a woman who had asked for time and space, and who feared, with every day of silence, that he was losing her entirely. The distance between them, born of one honest deception, and now compounded by a rival's careful cruelty, grew wider than either of them intended, and neither seemed to know how to close it. There was one further difficulty before the crisis came, and it arrived in the shape of Julian's uncle, Lord Everard, a stern and humorless man who had managed the Ashbourne estates during Julian's minority, and who regarded the whole arrangement with the particular suspicion of a man who trusted ledgers far more than he trusted feeling. "You cannot mean to let sentiment govern a duke's marriage," Lord Everard said one afternoon, cornering Julian in the estate office, with the air of a man delivering an unwelcome but necessary correction. "The girl is unremarkable, her family a minor embarrassment saved only by your generosity, and now I hear you paraded your affection for her before half the county's gentry, as though you were a besotted schoolboy, rather than the head of one of the oldest titles in England." Vivienne, at least, understood how to comport herself with the dignity the position required. "Vivienne," Julian said, with a coldness that made even his hardened uncle pause, "understood how to smile at my title while she calculated the worth of a better one elsewhere. I will not have her held up to me as an example of dignity, uncle, not now, and not ever again. And the Hartley girl, what has she calculated, precisely, beyond the considerable debt you have already forgiven her family?" "Nothing," Julian said. "That is precisely the point you refuse to understand. She has calculated nothing at all, and it is the first time in 3 years that anyone in my acquaintance has looked at me and seen a man rather than a fortune to be won or a title to be secured. I would rather be thought a besotted fool by every gossip in the county than spend the remainder of my life married to another woman's careful arithmetic." Lord Everard left the office unconvinced, and made no secret, in the days that followed, of his continued disapproval, offering Eleanor a courtesy so brittle and correct that it amounted to its own quiet insult. But his opposition, however wearing, proved a smaller trial than the one Cordelia had already begun preparing, with far greater patience and far sharper cunning, for the evening of the harvest ball. The crisis came, as such things often do, at a ball. Ashbourne hosted its harvest gathering each autumn, a tradition older than the current Duke's memory, and this year it fell only days after Cordelia's arrival, drawing half the county's gentry into the great hall beneath candlelight and garlands of late roses. Eleanor, dressed in a gown borrowed from necessity rather than fashion, felt keenly the eyes that assessed her, the future duchess who had arrived with barely a dowry, whose family's debts were by now common knowledge among the assembled guests. Cordelia, resplendent in silk that could have paid for 3 of Eleanor's gowns, made certain the whole room understood the contrast. "Miss Hartley," she said, loudly enough for a cluster of nearby ladies to hear, "you must tell us, is it true your father's debts nearly cost him the family home entirely? How very lucky that the Duke's need for an unremarkable, undemanding bride arrived just in time to save you both." A ripple of amusement passed through the listening ladies, and Eleanor felt her face burn, felt the old, familiar shame of being weighed and found insufficient rise up exactly as it had 100 times in her life before. She opened her mouth to answer, though with what, she did not yet know, when a voice cut through the room with a coldness the county had always claimed as the Duke's chief quality, and which he now, for the first time in Eleanor's presence, turned to devastating use. "Lady Cordelia," Julian said, crossing the floor to stand directly beside Eleanor, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the suddenly silent hall. "I find myself curious. In all the years I have known you, I do not recall a single instance in which you gave anything to anyone without first calculating what it might earn you in return." Miss Hartley gave a stranger her only shawl on a cold road, expecting nothing, knowing nothing of his fortune or his name. "I have never, in my life, known a more accurate measure of a person's true worth than that single unwitnessed act of kindness. I would ask you to consider, before you speak of debts and desperation again, which of you I would choose to marry if fortune were entirely removed from the question." The silence that followed was absolute. Cordelia's face had gone pale, then furious, then carefully, brittly composed, and she withdrew from the hall, moments later on the arm of an obliging cousin. Her campaign, for all practical purposes, ended. Eleanor stood beside the Duke, her heart hammering, aware of every eye in the room upon them both, and aware, too, that he had just done publicly and unmistakably what he had failed to do privately in all the careful days before. He had chosen her, openly, without hedge or hesitation, in front of the very society whose judgment he had spent 3 years guarding himself against. "You did not need to do that," she said quietly, once the music had resumed and the room's attention had begun, reluctantly, to disperse elsewhere. "I have needed to do it since the moment you gave a stranger your shawl in the rain," he said. "I was only too great a coward, until tonight, to do it where anyone could hear." They did not speak again that evening beyond the necessary courtesies of a hostess and her betrothed, but something had shifted, unmistakably, in the current between them, and Eleanor found herself, for the first time since the crossroads, wanting to close the distance rather than guard it. She found him 3 days later in the library, alone, a single lamp burning low against the early winter dusk, a book open before him that he did not appear to be reading. "I have been thinking," she said, "about the road." He looked up, and something careful and hopeful moved across his face in equal measure. "So have I. Rather constantly, if I am honest, which I understand is meant to be my one remaining virtue with you. You said," she continued, coming further into the room, "that no one had shown you honest kindness in 3 years. I have been trying to decide whether that changes what you did. The disguise, the silence, the days you let me believe you were nobody in particular. And what have you decided?" "That it does not excuse it," she said, "but that I understand it rather better than I wished to, and that understanding, according to your aunt, is often the first bridge across an unforgivable thing." She stopped a few feet from his chair. "I do not think what you did was unforgivable, Julian. I think it was the act of a man so afraid of being loved for the wrong reasons that he nearly lost the chance to be loved for the right ones." He rose slowly, as though afraid any sudden movement might break whatever fragile thing was forming between them. "And is there a chance," he asked quietly, "that I might still be loved for the right ones?" "There is one thing I must ask first," she said, and though her voice was steady, he seemed to sense at once that something more difficult lay beneath it. "My father's letter told me the sum you forgave was far greater than I had understood. Greater, I think, than a family in our circumstances could ever have hoped to refuse you, whatever manner of woman I turned out to be. I have spent a week wondering whether the shawl mattered to you at all, or whether I would have found myself standing in this house regardless, married to a stranger who had already secured my compliance before he ever stepped into the rain." Julian was silent a long moment, and when he answered, there was no trace of practiced ease in his voice at all, only a rawness she had come to recognize as his truest register. "The debt was settled before I ever left London," he said. My solicitor arranged it the week your father's name first appeared on that ledger, months before I ever thought to travel in disguise to see what sort of woman I had agreed to marry. I could have arrived at Ashbourne in my own carriage, in my own name, and claimed you exactly as the arrangement required, and no one, least of all your father, would have thought to question it. I chose the road instead, Eleanor, and the borrowed coat, and the risk of freezing in a storm beside a stranger's frightened horse, for no reason a solicitor's ledger could ever explain. I did it because I did not wish to marry a debt. I wished, foolishly perhaps, to marry a woman, and I did not know how else to find out whether such a woman existed behind the arrangement, except to meet her before she knew to perform for a duke. Then the debt was never in question, Eleanor said slowly, regardless of what I did or did not do on that road. Never, Julian said. You could have looked at that shivering stranger with contempt, or with indifference, or with nothing at all, and I would still have married you exactly as planned, and your family would still have kept their home. The shawl changed nothing about the arrangement, Eleanor. It changed everything about what I hoped the arrangement might become. Something in Eleanor's chest, some last guarded knot she had not fully realized she was still carrying, loosened at last. Then I have wronged you, she said quietly, by doubting it. You have wronged no one, he said. You have only done what any sensible woman does, when a man gives her every reason to doubt him and calls it caution. I do not blame you for the doubt, Eleanor. I only hope to spend a great many years proving it need never return. I gave a stranger my only shawl on a cold road, Eleanor said, because I believed in that moment that kindness owed to a person owes nothing to their rank or fortune. I find I do not wish to withdraw that kindness now, simply because the stranger turned out to be a duke. I loved the man on the road, Julian, before I ever knew to fear the title beside his name. I find that has not changed, whatever else has. There remained, of course, the small matter of the wedding itself, and the county's endless appetite for gossip regarding the Duke's unconventional courtship, and Lady Prescott's determined efforts to claim full credit for the match at every dinner party for the remainder of the season. There remained Cordelia's cold civility whenever their paths crossed, softened only slightly by time, and the eventual, entirely satisfactory news of her own engagement to a wealthy baron the following spring, which restored her spirits considerably, if not her pride. But these were small things, footnotes to the larger truth that had settled, quietly and completely, into the halls of Ashbourne in the weeks that followed. That a duke who had spent 3 years perfecting the art of coldness had been undone, entirely and gladly, by a woman who had given her only shawl to a stranger on a rain-swept road, expecting nothing in return. They married in the small stone chapel on the estate grounds in early spring, when the orangery's lemon trees had begun to flower, and the gardens Eleanor had once walked in careful solitude were bright with the first crocuses of the season. She wore, beneath her wedding gown, the same grey woolen shawl she had once given away and had received back, dried and folded, from a stranger's careful hands, a small private joke between them that no one else in the chapel understood, and that made the Duke, watching her walk toward him down the narrow aisle, smile in a way the county would later swear they had never once seen before that day. "You once told me," he murmured, as she reached him, "that generosity confused with investment was no generosity at all. I remember. I have thought of little else since," he said, "except how fortunate I am that you gave away something so precious without once calculating what it might return to you. It returned to you a duke, Eleanor, though I hope you will forgive me for saying I think you would have been just as content with the coachman you believed me to be." "I would have been," she said, smiling despite the tears gathering unbidden at the corners of her eyes, "though I confess I do not mind the Duke either, now that I know the man beneath the title so well." Outside the chapel, the bells began to ring across the valley, carrying the news to every farm and cottage within hearing that Ashbourne's long winter of coldness had ended, and that the woman who had ended it had done so not with fortune, nor birth, nor any of the calculations society so carefully taught its daughters, but with nothing more or less than a single, unguarded act of warmth, freely given to a stranger, who had needed it more than either of them could have known. And in the years that followed, when the county's gossips told the story of the Duke of Ashbourne's marriage, as they told it often, and with increasing embellishment, they always began the same way. That it was said the Duchess had once given her only shawl to a ragged stranger on a storm-swept road, never dreaming that the man she comforted would one day comfort her in return, for the whole of a long and happy life, as Duke and husband both, but first, and always, as the friend she had made without ever asking what it might cost her to be kind. The shawl itself, grey and unremarkable, and mended more than once over the years, was kept afterward in a cedar chest in the Duchess's own rooms, brought out each winter and worn again on the coldest evenings, not because Ashbourne's fires ever failed to warm its halls, but because Eleanor found she liked the reminder it carried, that the truest measure of any heart was never what it wore, or what it owned, or what name it answered to on a rain-swept road, but simply what it was willing to give away, freely, to a stranger who might never have the chance to give anything back. Julian never forgot it either. Long after the county had stopped whispering about the strange courtship of the Duke of Ashbourne, long after Cordelia's schemes had faded into the harmless anecdote of an old rivalry, long after Lady Prescott had exhausted every guest at every dinner with her insistence that she alone had foreseen the match, the Duke would still, on the coldest nights of winter, find his wife's shawl folded near the hearth, and would remember, with the same quiet wonder he had felt on that first storm-drenched evening, that he had been saved, not by fortune, not by title, not by any of the careful architecture he had built around his own guarded heart, but by a woman who had looked at a shivering stranger on a muddy road and had simply, without calculation or hesitation, decided that he was worth keeping warm. It was, he often told her in later years, the finest bargain he had ever made, though she reminded him each time, with the same stubborn honesty that had first undone him, that she had never meant it as a bargain at all. She had only meant it as kindness. Everything else, the title, the estate, the long and tender years of marriage that followed, had simply been what kindness, freely given and honestly returned, was capable of becoming, when two guarded hearts finally allowed themselves to be truly known.